Chapter 9. The Heat is On. Mrs. Hutton was a mess. Mr. Hutton was furious. Mrs. Thatcher was crying, and Dr. Thatcher, his face still dotted with mashed potatoes, was laughing so hard he could barely stand up. People always laugh about this kind of thing after they get done being upset, he told Jeremy later. The Huttons will be telling this story for years. I figure, why wait? If I'm going to be amused later, I might as well be amused now. As none of the other adults seemed to share Dr. Thatcher's philosophy, the evening came to an early, uneasy end. A premature death, as Dr. Thatcher phrased it. Even though no one blamed Jeremy for the trouble, he spent the rest of the night wallowing in guilt. Things didn't improve any the next morning when Mary Lou caught him on the way to school. He had too many other things on his mind to try to escape her, so she walked all the way to school with him. The fact that she didn't try to kiss him didn't stop Howard and Freddie from making loud, sloppy, smacking sounds as soon as Jeremy and Mary Lou entered the building. While Jeremy was trying to decide whether taking a pop at one of them was worth getting beat up for, the principal walked up and said, "I want to see the two of you in my office." Jeremy's stomach began to squirm so violently that he felt as though he had swallowed something that was still alive. What now? He wondered miserably as they followed Mr. Martinez. "You first, Mr. Thatcher," said the principal. He gestured for Jeremy to take a seat inside, then sat behind his own desk. Folding his hands in front of him, he said, "Are you having trouble in art class?" To Jeremy's surprise, the man's voice was mild, almost friendly. Even more surprising was the effect this question had on Jeremy's emotions. He felt as if Mr. Martinez had unlocked something hidden deep inside him. A flood of anger and sorrow raged through his body, and tears pricked at the corner of his eyes. He knew if he tried to talk, he would break down and sob. The storm of emotion disturbed Tiamat. At the back of his head he could sense her stirring from her slumber. Mr. Martinez stared at him. "I said, are you having trouble in art class?" Still afraid to speak, Jeremy nodded. Mr. Martinez looked away. "Not every teacher is right for every student," he said at last. Jeremy was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. Mr. Martinez straightened his tie. "If you have another day when you just can't cope with art, why don't you come down here for a little while?" Jeremy tried to answer but couldn't get the words past the lump in his throat. "Do you understand me?" asked the principal. His voice had a harder edge now. "If you can't cope, you can come here, but just don't take off. I can't let you do that." Jeremy nodded numbly. Mr. Martinez escorted him out of the office, then gestured to Mary Lou. "Did he yell at you?" she whispered as she walked past Jeremy. Her eyes were wide. He shook his head. He started walking toward the classroom, then decided to wait for Mary Lou. When she came out, they walked back to the room together. "He didn't yell at me either," said Mary Lou, sounding relieved. Specimen rolled his eyes when he saw the two of them enter. Jeremy wanted to explain, but he still didn't trust himself to say anything. A large chunk of emotion seemed to have lodged in his throat, and he wasn't sure he could get any words past it without cutting the emotion loose, too. Since he wasn't interested in spending the next several minutes crying in front of the entire class, he remained silent. During recess, he didn't join the baseball game, as he normally would have. Instead, he sat under one of the small trees that had been planted when the school was built. He was scratching a picture in the dirt with a stick when he noticed a strange shadow in front of him. Looking up, he saw Tiamat circling overhead. Her red wings looked like streamers of blood in the afternoon sunshine. "How did you get here?" thought Jeremy in panic. The dragon coasted down to his shoulder. She was nearly as long as his arm now, and he lurched a little with the weight of her. He hadn't framed his question in a form she could understand, so he got no answer. He paused. Figuring out the best way to communicate with the dragon was like working a puzzle. Finally, he sent a mental image of Tiamat sleeping at home, along with the question feeling. Tiamat's response was a picture of himself, looking sad. He took this to mean she had been worried about him. But how had she gotten out of his room, not to mention the house? Her answer made him a little nervous about just how smart she was getting to be. It consisted of a series of pictures. In the first, she flew up to the ceiling and began puffing at the smoke detector mounted above his door. The second showed Jeremy's father rushing into the room, looking worried. The third showed Tiamat taking advantage of the open door to escape from his room. Finally, she offered him an image of the little door the cats used to go in and out, a door just wide enough for a small dragon if it folded its wings tightly against its sides. "Go home," thought Jeremy, sending her an image of herself returning through the little door. Tiamat's response felt like a frown inside his head. She didn't want to go home. He felt bad, and he needed her here. "I feel fine," insisted Jeremy. But it's hard to lie when you're communicating with thoughts instead of words. He didn't feel fine, and they both knew it, so Tiamat stayed. As if things weren't bad enough, Mary Lou showed up next. "She's here!" she cried in delight. Jeremy nodded. "How come the others don't see her?" Jeremy shrugged. "There's a lot about dragons I haven't figured out." Tiamat sent him a little wave of smugness. To his enormous relief, Mr. Siegel waved his hand to announce it was time to go back inside. They started toward the door, Jeremy hanging back a little so that no one would accidentally touch Tiamat. "Go home," he urged again as the line approached the school. Tiamat refused. Jeremy trudged into the building carrying the dragon on his shoulder. In the classroom, Tiamat slithered down Jeremy's arm, crawled under his desk, and curled up at his feet. She lay there, snoozing contentedly, while he worked on his math test. He was glad she had consumed all her milk that morning. He was giving it to her in a mixing bowl now, and she was gulping down at least a quart at a time. Jeremy frowned. His parents were already wondering where all the milk was going. Before long, he would have to start buying it out of his allowance. I suppose it's worth it to keep her calm, he thought. He checked under his desk. She raised her head and gave him a dreamy dragon smile. He smiled back. They had made it through the first half hour without any trouble, and her presence actually had helped him calm down. That was partly out of necessity. If he didn't force himself to be calm, who knew what Tiamat might do? He finished his test and looked around. Mary Lou was staring at him. When she saw him look at her, she blushed and smiled. "Oh, what the heck," he thought, and smiled back. Her blush deepened to crimson, and she turned away. Jeremy was surprised. Maybe he wasn't powerless against Mary Lou after all. I wonder what would happen if I sent a note saying I wanted to kiss her. Would she run away and leave me alone for good? He shook his head. What if she took him seriously? The risk definitely was not worth it. As Mr. Siegel was collecting the tests, someone knocked at the door. Before anyone could get up, the door swung open. Mr. Kravitz stepped in. Jeremy's reaction to the man woke Tiamat, who poked her head out from under the desk. "I've come to discuss the spring art contest," said Mr. Kravitz. Jeremy's interest perked up. This was what he'd been waiting for. "As you know, the contest is sponsored by the Downtown Merchants Association. They want things they can use to decorate their storefronts. As always, the grand winner gets to paint the giant window of Zambrino's department store. You're all invited to enter, but I don't want to see anything but your best work. This contest is going to represent the school, and I want us to look good." That made sense. But true to his fashion, Mr. Kravitz managed to say it in a way that made it seem very insulting. As the man talked, Jeremy found himself getting angrier and angrier. He knew it was a bad idea, but he couldn't help himself. It wasn't until he saw Tiamat slinking down the aisle that he realized what a major mistake it was to let his emotions get out of hand. "Tiamat," he thought desperately, "get back here." Since he forgot to frame the command in pictures, the dragon ignored him. He searched for an image, then sent a picture of Tiamat crawling back under his desk. She responded with a picture of Mr. Kravitz hopping around on one foot. Jeremy's heart began to pound. "What are you up to?" No answer. Mr. Kravitz launched into a lecture on his standards for entries he was willing to submit to the Merchants Association. I don't want any of this green sky and pink grass stuff that some of you like to do, he said. Jeremy heard Mary Lou gasp as Tiamat reached the front of the room and crouched beside Mr. Kravitz's left foot. After all, continued the art teacher, I'm not going to have the people of this town think I haven't taught you anything about color. Jeremy, watching Tiamat warily, doubted that anyone would believe a sixth grader who colored grass pink was doing anything but having fun. And I don't want any of this fantasy stuff, continued Mr. Kravitz, as Tiamat began to breathe on his foot. No dragons or any nonsense like that. Yeah, let's not use our imaginations, thought Jeremy bitterly. By this time he was so fed up with Mr. Kravitz he didn't really care what Tiamat did. He watched her ribs rise and fall as she puffed on the art teacher's foot. And another thing, said Mr. Kravitz. He was starting to look uncomfortable now, and he lifted his foot to rub it against the back of his trousers. I want you to... Suddenly he bent down and stared at his shoe. Tiamat gave another puff, and it started to smoke. Mr. Kravitz tore off the shoe and began hopping about on one foot. Ow! He cried. Ow! Ow! It was just like the image Tiamat had sent to Jeremy. He could sense her smugness as she slithered back to his desk, and he had to bite down on the corners of his mouth to kill his laughter. Mr. Siegel jumped up and stared at Mr. Kravitz. He started forward, then stopped, as if he couldn't figure out what to do. Mr. Kravitz stared at his shoe in puzzlement. Most of the kids sat in wide-eyed astonishment. Given the art teacher's temper, Jeremy knew this was the safest reaction. Even so, from here and there around the room he could hear little snorts of laughter. Mary Lou, the only kid besides Jeremy who knew what had really happened, had her hands over her mouth. Mr. Kravitz glared at the offenders. I do not find this very amusing, he shouted. He examined his shoe carefully, searching for signs of tampering. I want to know who did this, he said, and I want to know now. When no one answered, Mr. Kravitz grew even angrier. That does it, he roared. Until the coward who did this confesses, room 19 is banned from the art contest. Tucking his scorched shoe under his arm, he stormed out of the room, giving the door a wall-rattling slam as he left. The class breathed out together, as if on some kind of signal. Can he really do that? Asked Specimen, his voice trembling. Do what? Asked Mr. Siegel. Ban us from the art contest? Their teacher frowned. Probably. The look on Specimen's face twisted Jeremy's stomach. Tiamat sent the question feeling, but Jeremy didn't know how to respond. The whole problem seemed too complicated to put into images. An hour ago, he and Specimen had seemed like sure winners. Now, in order for either of them to enter the contest, he, Jeremy, would have to confess to something he hadn't done, and confess it to the man he disliked most in the whole world.